In practice, Bloodline-Only IO treats covenant identity as exhaustively and exclusively determined by immutable biological descent from Jacob, Israel, all other forms of covenant participation, law observance, circumcision, Passover inclusion, covenant oath membership, or proselytization, are acknowledged only as functional permissions or obligations, not as identity-conferring mechanisms. While tribal land inheritance is often cited as corroborating evidence, it is not the defining criterion, rather the underlying premise is that no legal, cultic, or covenantal mechanism could ever confer true Israelite identity apart from genealogy. Genealogy alone functions as the decisive and non-transferable boundary of covenant identity. The question that must be answered is simple. What Scripture actually teaches that? The following question was recently posed to Bloodline-Only IO proponents in the most modest terms possible. Can you provide even one biblical text that explicitly defines covenant identity as nothing more than tribal land inheritance or immutable biological descent? If such a text exists, the discussion is settled. If it does not exist, then the Bloodline-Only model must be reassessed in light of Scripture's actual covenant framework. This question does not concern labels, camps, personalities, debate challenges, or theatrics. It concerns whether the Bible itself ever defines covenant identity in the way Bloodline-Only IO requires. To date, no answer to the question has been given with a definitive Scripture. Rather than providing a text, responses from Bloodline-Only IO proponents were primarily attempts to divert, chest-thumping challenges to debate, attempts to intimidate and dominate, condescending language, accusations of how I'm not IO, which is just boundary policing, and other predictable patterns of evasion. For example, 1. Denial of the premise. One response claimed, "That's not what Bloodline-Only IO believes. This is false. If covenant identity cannot be acquired apart from immutable biological descent, then covenant identity is, by definition, biologically restricted. Denying that premise while simultaneously insisting on biological exclusivity is not clarification, it is contradiction used to avoid scrutiny. 2. Category confusion, identity versus standing. Another attempted to shift the discussion from covenantal identity to what is required to remain faithful within the covenant. These are separate categories. Obedience conditions presuppose membership. They do not define how membership is obtained. Appealing to covenant obligations does not answer the question of how covenant identity is established in the first place. 3. Appeal to election without definition. Another evasion attempt was to appeal to God's oath to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 17. But election explains how the covenant enters history, not how covenant identity is exhaustively defined. Genesis 17 explicitly complicates biological absolutism by placing non-seed members under the covenant sign and calling that sign the covenant. If biology alone marked covenant identity, that inclusion would make no sense. Election identifies the historical channel of the covenant. It does not, by itself, define the full boundary of covenant membership. 4. Substitution of promise for covenant identity. Another evasion was to redirect the discussion to the promise, as though covenant identity were irrelevant. This does not answer the question. The promise explains inheritance and fulfillment. It does not define who is covenantally counted. Shifting from covenant identity to promise is a category substitution, not an argument. 5. Burden shifting. Some attempted to shift the burden of proof by demanding that I show where the Bible changes the meaning of descendants. However, I have not claimed that Scripture redefines descendants. I am arguing that Scripture never explicitly defines covenant identity as nothing more than biological descent in the first place. The burden rests on the party asserting exclusivity to produce the defining text. 6. The straw man. The question I have asked: can you provide even one biblical text that explicitly defines covenant identity as nothing more than tribal land inheritance or immutable biological descent has been called a straw man? But this too is false. A straw man misrepresents an opponent's claim. The question asked of Bloodline-Only IO does the opposite. It asks Bloodline-Only IO advocates to state explicitly what they are already, treating as true in practice, namely, that covenant identity is governed by immutable biological descent and tribal inheritance. If that premise is genuinely biblical, asking where Scripture defines it is not a distortion, it's basic methodological rigor. Narrative origin is not the same thing as definitional boundary and assumptions. Inferred from the story are not the same as statements made by the text. Until such a defining text is produced, the bloodline-only position remains an interpretive inference rather than a biblical definition. More importantly, the objection collapses under its own weight. If covenant identity truly is anchored in genealogy and tribal land inheritance in the way Bloodline-Only IO assumes, then producing a verse that says so should be easy. In short, the question isn't a straw man, it's a diagnostic. It exposes whether Bloodline-Only IO is grounded in an explicit biblical definition, or in a pattern that has been elevated to the status of definition after the fact. The persistent refusal to answer it directly suggests the latter, not the former. The logical conclusion: if Bloodline-Only IO is as strong as its proponents claim, it should be easy to produce one verse, even one that explicitly defines covenant identity as nothing more than tribal land inheritance or immutable biological descent, one that excludes lawful incorporation of outsiders. No such verse has been produced. Until, or unless it is, the only reasonable conclusion is that Bloodline-Only IO rests on assumptions and presuppositions, not on an explicit biblical definition. And if Scripture never defines covenant identity in the way Bloodline-Only IO requires, then Bloodline-Only IO is not a biblical doctrine. In contrast, the covenantal inclusion model of IO resolves the weaknesses inherent in bloodline absolutism. Covenantal inclusion demonstrates, across Torah, the prophets, and Second Temple practice, that non-biological outsiders could be lawfully incorporated into Israel's covenant community and counted as Israelites without erasing genealogical distinctions related to land inheritance. This model accounts for non-genealogical Israelites like Caleb, Ruth, Rahab, proselytes like Nicholas, and God-fearers like Cornelius without special pleading. It also preserves Israel-only audience relevance, avoids importing modern universalism, aligns with ancient covenant, law and legal categories, and it explains the full range of biblical data Bloodline-Only IO cannot. For these reasons, covenantal inclusion is not a departure from IO, but is a stronger, more coherent, and more complete articulation of it, one grounded in Scripture, history, and scholarship rather than assumption.